Hi class, welcome back. We're now in chapter 4. And the song you just heard was I Want to Hold Your Hand by the Beatles. So that brings us to the British invasion. So in this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about the environment in the UK and the environment in the United States at the time that allowed this to sort of coalesce and occur. Now, in America, if you remember, those first wave of rock and rollers, Buddy Holly, Elvis Presley, Chuck Berry, Little Richard, right? They all seemed between 55 and 58 and 59, then it was all gone. Just disappeared. So that brill building, teeny pop, bubblegum pop age is in, right? With Chubby Checker, with dances like The Twist, and everything sort of very homogenized music coming out at the time, very producer driven. Now, go over to the UK. They're still living in a very post-war environment. Not a lot of money, people mostly taking for government jobs and going to schools. So in this port town of Liverpool, that's where we find these four lads, right? First, it's Paul McCartney and John Lennon, which they meet in 1957 at a concert for a group that John Lennon was performing in called the Quarrymen. And they were a skiffle group. Now, skiffle in the UK was a very unique kind of music at the time with guys like Donny Lonergan. And they were doing this combination of folk, sort of country western, early traditional jazz. It's a very unique combination of which you'll hear. All right? Now, they get together and then they find this very young, talented guitar player, George Harrison, right? And then they find this drummer, Pete Best. Well, some people go, what? I don't understand. Pete Best was actually the original drummer for the Beatles. Now, what happens later is you're going to see as they start recording for a guy named George Martin, right? This unique combination, it doesn't quite solidify yet. There's all kinds of stories as to why Pete Best eventually did get kicked out. And then there was another group called Jerry and the Pacemakers, and their drummer was a guy named Richard Starkey. His nickname was Ringo Starr. So they bring them together. That's the Fab Four that we know today, right? Now, they had a big following in the UK, and then famously, as you'll hear about, their performances in Germany, where they really got their game together. And they were influenced in Liverpool listening to those exact same first wavers that I was talking to you about, right? Listening on radio. And then going down to a place called Nems, it was owned by the Epstein family, specifically this guy, Brian Epstein, who eventually becomes their manager. Right? So they're listening to these records, they're listening to radio at night, learning how to play, and then eventually learning how to write songs. Now, they had tried EMI, which is the record label they're on, to get them into the UK, to get them from the UK to the United States. However, British groups just didn't break into American markets. Strange story, where basically in Washington, D.C., one young girl calls into a radio station asking about the Beatles. They don't have the Beatles, they got to find out, and it explodes from there. Now, you hear people over and over again say, there'll never be another Beatles. Well, that's true. Only because there'll never be another 1963 to 1964 again. So you got to remember when people would first start hearing the Beatles, or young kids on the radio in America, and they were ready for something else. They took this first wave, sort of aggressive, rebel rock and roll of the mid and late 1950s, polished it their own way, and are bringing it back to us. And it's going to open the floodgates for British band after British band after British band. Now, this slow roll of information, very different than what we have today. So they'd hear a song on the radio, go, that's the Beatles. You can't really see them. Like, oh, then they finally get a picture. And then with magazines like a Teen Beat magazine, then they get little stories, a couple more pictures, another song. And remember, there weren't full records yet. This was not the popular music model. It was 45s with an A and B side. And that's how the Beatles' music started coming over. And they were getting popular. So we have to remember this is a real slow build until eventually Ed Sullivan solidifies them for his show on February 9th in 1964. Now, the Beatles' arrival at JFK Airport a few days before the Ed Sullivan show was epic. Right? There were so many screaming fans, mostly teenage girls. They were so loud that they were louder than the jet engines on the tarmac. That's pretty epic. Now, this coming to America of the Beatles opened up a floodgate of other bands. Now, there was also another scene going on in London different than what was going on in places like Liverpool, because they had a different influence, still an American influence. But most of these bands were listening to American electric blues groups like T-Bone Walker, Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, a lot of the Chess Records artists, okay? So that scene, that sort of unique cauldron in London was what helped create the band the Rolling Stones. And then now you have the A and B, and you'll see sort of the good guys and the bad boys, right? Now, as you're going to see with the Beatles, as they get more influenced by American politics and American sociological politics, right? The civil rights movement being one, the other, the Vietnam War. We'll talk a little bit more in some of our other videos about this environment in the 60s and how it shapes some of this music. But the Beatles are a really large reflection of that. All right? Take care. I'll see you guys in the next video.